My name is Jonas Richter. I am 38. This happened in Tate's Hell State Forest, Florida. I'd been seeking solace in isolation ever since my divorce, and the shadows of my military past began to weigh on me. I craved solitude and the raw challenge of survival in a place where nature reigned unchecked. With just a few supplies, my trusted rifle, and my loyal bloodhound, Bruno, I set out into the swamplands of Tate's Hell, a notorious patch of wilderness whispered about by locals for its dark legends and inexplicable disappearances. I arrived at an abandoned hunting shack that looked as if it had been swallowed by the relentless encroachment of vines and swamp water. I set up camp, intent on spending a few quiet days hunting and reflecting on my past. I wasn't one for ghost stories or superstitions, but as night fell, even I couldn't ignore the primal signals of danger. That first night, as I lay in my makeshift shelter listening to the symphony of crickets and distant croaks, Bruno's low growl snapped me from uneasy dreams. I sat up, heart pounding, as the dog's hackles rose and his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the flimsy light of my lantern. I strained to see what he sensed, but the heavy mist and dense canopy offered nothing more than shadows and the faint rustle of unseen movements. In the stillness, a faint knocking began, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was tapping on the bark of the ancient cypress trees encircling the camp. I dismissed it at first as a trick of the wind, but the sound grew persistent, almost taunting. The next morning, I found a series of animal carcasses arranged in strange, almost ritualistic symbols around the camp perimeter. My survival instincts screamed that something was wrong here. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched by forces far older and more malevolent than any mere animal. A few days into my solitude, I received an unexpected call from Lucas Brenner, a name from my past when I was still in the military. Lucas was 42, charming in a dangerously disarming way, and known for his thrill-seeking behavior despite being unreliable. He had been drifting, apparently, and now claimed he needed a break from the city's relentless chaos. I welcomed the company, thinking that a shared campfire and conversation might ease the loneliness of these wild lands. Lucas arrived one misty morning, greeting me with a strained smile and a hastily packed duffel bag. He spoke of escaping debts and shady characters in the city, though I sensed an underlying desperation in his eyes. Despite my reservations, I allowed him to join me, hoping that his presence might even provide an extra pair of eyes in this dangerous, isolated environment. That evening, as the sun bled out behind a horizon of twisted trees, things took a turn. While sitting by the dying embers of our campfire, Lucas suddenly stiffened. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling with both fear and anticipation. Bruno began to snarl at the dark tree line, his hackles raised as if trying to warn us of an approaching storm. Before either of us could react further, an unsettling hush fell over the swamp. The usual chorus of night creatures was conspicuously absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. I decided to check the perimeter and took Bruno along, leaving Lucas by the dying fire. As we walked, I recalled the animal carcasses from the previous morning, their eerie arrangement now gnawing at my gut with foreboding. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement among the shadows. A pale, twisted figure lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. When I shined the beam on it, the creature's form seemed to warp and shift, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been a human face. But the eyes were not human. They burned with a fierce, yellow intensity, and its grin stretched too wide, revealing rotted teeth. In a voice that seemed to be stitched together from the whispers of the swamp, it murmured words I couldn't understand. Bruno barked furiously, and I was compelled to retreat back to camp with my heart hammering in my chest. That night, the terror deepened. While I slept fitfully, I was repeatedly awoken by distant knocking on the trees and Bruno's frantic barking. Lucas, who had insisted he was trying to catch up on sleep, appeared increasingly agitated. At one point, I overheard him muttering under his breath about owing someone money and about the right kind of refuge he needed. I felt a growing dread that his arrival might have brought more than just company. In the dead of night, as I tried to stifle my mounting anxiety, chaos erupted. I was abruptly grabbed from behind and knocked unconscious. When I awoke, I found myself bound to a fallen log with rough rope biting into my wrists. The dense fog of the swamp mingled with a haze of pain and confusion. My head throbbed as I struggled to piece together the events that had led to this betrayal. It didn't take long for me to realize I had been ambushed by a group of men. Hard, ruthless-looking men armed with crude weapons and modern firearms. Their faces were hardened by violence, and their eyes carried the cold glint of men accustomed to dealing in fear. I soon discovered the terrible truth. These were drug traffickers who used the isolation of Tate's hell as a hideout for their illicit operations, and Lucas, the one friend I trusted, had led them right to me. I heard muffled voices as the traffickers argued about what to do with me. One of them sneered, "He's nothing but a liability." Their plan was grim. They intended to leave me for dead, stripping away any supplies I might have. Meanwhile, in the confusion, Bruno had broken free and was attacking one of the men. In the melee, I heard a gunshot. Bruno's cry of pain echoed through the humid night. I fought against my bonds, adrenaline surging, but my strength was fading as the traffickers closed in with renewed brutality. Then, amid the carnage, the unthinkable happened. The atmosphere shifted abruptly. The traffickers' crude plans were interrupted by a presence that was as surreal as it was horrifying. The air turned icy, and the flickering lights of our camp suddenly died. A thick, impenetrable mist rolled in, swallowing the frantic shouts and the scent of gunpowder. Out of the murk emerged the swamp hag, known in whispered legends as Mama Wren. I can scarcely describe the sight. Standing at the edge of the clearing, the hag was a grotesque caricature of an old woman. Her skin was mottled and swamp-stained, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, and her elongated fingers moved as if tugged by invisible strings. She advanced with a jerking, unnatural gait, and the very air around her seemed to hum with a soundless menace. The traffickers, already on edge, began to unravel. One of them, a man whose eyes had betrayed a haunting vulnerability, suddenly cried out, "Grandma, come home," as though the spectral figure before him had taken on the visage of a long-dead loved one. Confusion and terror rippled through the group. In the ensuing panic, one man bolted from the clearing, only to vanish into the fog with blood-curdling screams echoing after him. Another was struck down by an unseen force. His tongue ripped out in a sickening display of violence that left him gurgling in horror. I managed to free myself from my bindings in the ensuing chaos. With my heart pounding and the taste of blood in my mouth, I scrambled to my feet and aimed my rifle at the approaching horror. The hag's eyes locked onto mine for a moment, and in that gaze, I felt my sanity threaten to crumble. Her voice, a discordant symphony of whispers, filled my head with images of madness and despair. As I staggered back, I found Lucas huddled near the edge of the camp. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. He pleaded with me in a broken, nearly incoherent whisper, begging for help. I hesitated for a moment, a flicker of the old camaraderie, and then something in me hardened. The betrayal cut too deep, and I knew I had to escape this nightmare. I couldn't risk being dragged further into this hell, not with Lucas already sinking into it. I turned and ran into the swamp's labyrinthine paths, my rifle clutched tightly as I fumbled through the darkness. The haunting whispers of the hag followed me relentlessly, echoing through the trees, mingling with the distant, agonized cries of the traffickers. My only beacon of hope was the faint glow of my truck's headlights in the distance, a promise of escape from this living nightmare. I stumbled through the murky water and tangled undergrowth, my mind a maelstrom of fear and disbelief. When I finally reached my truck, I barely had time to check on Bruno. The poor dog was limping, his once bright eyes dim with pain. I managed to squeeze him into the back of the truck before igniting the engine and peeling out onto the only road that threaded through this forsaken place. As I sped away, the night behind me seemed to ripple with malevolence. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of Lucas standing in the middle of the road. His eyes were vacant, his face contorted in a horror that transcended human comprehension. Where his features should have been, there was now a void, as if his very identity had been erased by the darkness of Tate's hell. I didn't dare slow down. Every bump on the gravel road sent shudders through my body, each one a reminder of the night's unspeakable horrors. I drove until the oppressive weight of the swamp receded behind me, until the neon glare of civilization hinted at safety. Yet, even then, the memory of the hag's twisted grin and the echo of her whispered promises haunted me. In the days that followed, I reported the incident to local authorities, only to be met with skepticism and bureaucratic indifference. They found nothing more than scattered mud, a few broken bones, and a lingering odor of decay where the swamp had claimed its victims. Lucas was never found, and the traffickers, it seemed, had vanished into the tangled network of Florida's criminal underbelly. I was left with my nightmares, and the chilling certainty that some forces in Tate's hell were beyond human understanding. Bruno, my faithful companion, fought his injuries valiantly, but ultimately succumbed to the toll of that night's violence. I had no choice but to put him down, a decision that has left an indelible scar on my soul. I now live in constant vigilance, the memory of that night etched into my every waking moment. The guilt of abandoning Lucas, the haunting whispers of the swamp hag, and the betrayal of a friend, all weaved together into a tapestry of terror that I cannot escape. Every so often, I catch a glimpse of a shadow in the corner of my eye, and sometimes, in the silence of the night, I hear a distant knocking on the walls of my apartment, like the persistent, unyielding tap of a hand that refuses to let me forget Tate's hell. Some nights, as I lie in bed, I swear I can still hear a woman's voice, soft and insidious, calling my name from the depths of that cursed swamp. I know that what I experienced that night was no mere hallucination or trick of the mind. It was a convergence of real-world cruelty and something far more sinister, a force that twists reality and feeds on the fear of the desperate. I escaped Tate's hell with my life, but the price was far greater than I could have ever imagined. The nightmares, the guilt, and the knowledge that the swamp hag might one day follow me even into the safety of civilization have left me a broken man. I carry the weight of that night with me always, a constant reminder that some evils are not confined to legend, and that the wild, unforgiving darkness of the world can reach into your soul when you least expect it. My name is Samantha Ford. I am 35. This happened at Silent Pines, a rundown RV park on the edge of Cedar Lake in northern Florida. I had spent the better part of the last decade chasing stories as a journalist, always on the lookout for a hidden truth or an untold tragedy. But after a bitter breakup and the heavy weight of loss, I needed solitude, a chance to heal and to finally write my memoir without the constant distractions of the city. When I heard about Silent Pines, a remote RV park skirted by dense woods and lingering local legends, I thought it the perfect retreat. I arrived on a cool autumn afternoon, the fading sun casting long shadows over the weathered RVs and the quiet, almost desolate surroundings. I parked my newly restored RV in a secluded spot near the lake and took my first slow walk around the property. The park's few aging structures and the quiet murmurs of nature were oddly comforting. At the RV park office, I met Mary Jenkins, the longtime caretaker. Mary was a soft-spoken woman with tired eyes, her face etched by years of witnessing sorrow and secrets. She offered me a sparse smile and a few practical instructions for life at Silent Pines. Her manner was reserved, and I couldn't help but feel that she was guarding something, as if the past here was too painful to recount openly. Later that day, while I was unpacking and settling into my RV, I encountered another resident, a retired local sheriff named Walt Evans. I found him on a rickety porch outside a weather-beaten cabin near the park's edge. Walt was a sturdy man, his skin weathered like the surrounding oaks, and his voice carried a gentle authority. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, he warned me in a low, gravelly tone about Cedar Lake and its tragic history. He spoke of a woman, a wronged soul who had met a violent end, and whose spirit was said to wander the lake's shores on moonless nights. "They call her the Crying Widow," Walt said, eyes narrowing as if he could still see her specter. "Her wails are a premonition of misfortune." I nodded politely, though a part of me dismissed it as local superstition. After all, I was a woman of facts and tangible stories. That first night, I lay in the cramped space of my RV, trying to focus on the blank pages of my laptop. The gentle hum of the air conditioner mixed with the natural chorus of crickets outside. But as midnight approached, an eerie sound began to seep through the walls, a distant, mournful wailing that floated over Cedar Lake. It was unlike anything I had heard before, a keening cry that was at once heart-wrenching and deeply unsettling. I sat up, my fingers trembling as I reached for the lamp. The sound seemed to emanate from the lake itself, carried by the humid night air. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. Over the next several nights, the disturbances grew. I would hear soft footsteps on the gravel outside my RV, and on more than one occasion, I glimpsed the vague outline of a woman in a tattered white dress near the lake's edge, a fleeting silhouette that vanished as soon as I tried to focus. Determined to uncover the truth, I began scouring the RV for any clues left behind by previous visitors. In a forgotten storage nook beneath a dusty shelf, I discovered an old, leather-bound diary. Its pages were yellowed with age, filled with handwritten accounts of terror and despair. The diary belonged to someone who had encountered the Banshee, and its entries spoke of a woman betrayed by those she trusted, a woman whose tragic end had cursed the very land around Cedar Lake. Every line of the diary resonated with a sense of desperate longing and regret. I learned that the Banshee, known locally as the Crying Widow, had been a victim of a corrupt local official in the early 1900s. Betrayed and left to die after a violent encounter, her spirit had been condemned to wander the shores of the lake, her mournful cries warning of impending doom to anyone who dared disturb her resting place. The entries detailed eerie encounters much like what I had experienced, and they hinted at a possibility of appeasing her spirit by revealing the full truth of her story. Despite my rational nature, I found myself unable to ignore the mounting evidence of something supernatural. One particularly restless evening, I ventured out to Cedar Lake, the diary clutched tightly in my hand. The sky was overcast, and a dense mist had begun to roll in off the water, shrouding the shoreline in ghostly white. As I stood there, listening to the lapping of the waves and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees, I felt an oppressive sorrow hanging in the air. It was as if the lake itself was mourning. That same night, Walt visited unexpectedly. His lined face was drawn tight with concern. "Sam," "You've been hearing her, haven't you?" he asked quietly. His tone wasn't accusatory, it was laced with genuine fear and resignation. I nodded, struggling to find words. Walt insisted that I should be cautious, that Cedar Lake's past was best left undisturbed. He urged me to consider leaving before the Banshee's curse claimed another victim, but my curiosity had become an unyielding force. I promised him I would be careful and that I intended to document everything, to uncover the truth behind the tragic legend. Then, one morning, I woke to find Walt's cabin abandoned. There were signs of a hasty departure, a half-finished cup of coffee on the table, his favorite cap left on a chair. I asked Mary about him, but her eyes, usually so guarded, now flickered with a sorrow that I hadn't seen before. "He went to check on something by the lake," Mary said softly, her voice trembling. "He hasn't been back, and no one's seen him since." A chill ran down my spine. Walt had been a trusted guide in this strange place, and now he was gone without a trace. Determined to get to the bottom of Walt's disappearance, I began a more intensive study of the diary and the history of Cedar Lake. I spent hours at the small local library in the nearby ghost town, a forgotten relic itself, with the decaying newspapers and brittle books that told the stories of tragedies long past. I pieced together accounts of corruption, betrayal, and the unspeakable injustice inflicted upon the crying widow. Each new detail painted a picture of a community that had long since tried to bury its dark secrets. Yet the Banshee's lament was an echo of that unresolved pain, a specter that refused to fade away. One humid night, the terror reached its zenith. I was alone in my RV attempting to write down my findings when the unmistakable sound of wailing shattered the silence. It was louder than before, agonizing and filled with such deep sorrow that it felt as though my soul were being torn apart. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The mist was thicker than I'd ever seen, swirling around the RV like spectral fingers. And then I saw her, the crying widow. There, emerging from the dense fog at the water's edge, was the spectral figure of a woman in a ragged white dress. Her hair hung in wild tangles, and her eyes were hollow voids that seemed to pull at the very fabric of my sanity. I stood frozen as she moved closer, each step slow and deliberate, as if she were trapped between worlds. Her mouth opened in a silent wail, and for a moment I felt as if I could see flashes of her past, a life filled with hope, marred by betrayal, and ended in violent despair. My rational mind battled with the overwhelming terror, but there was something in her eyes that stirred a deep empathy within me. I remembered the diary's plea for the truth to be set free, for her story to be told. Trembling, I spoke into the oppressive silence. "I know your pain. I will tell your story, I promise." I wasn't sure if she understood my words, or if they would even reach the depths of her tortured soul. But as I whispered them, the Banshee's anguished wail softened into a sorrowful murmur. For a fleeting moment, the oppressive energy around us lightened, replaced by an overwhelming sadness that spoke of centuries of injustice. I rushed back to my RV, heart pounding, determined to document every detail. I spent the next several days piecing together every scrap of information I could find and writing feverishly in my journal. Mary continued to offer cryptic advice whenever I visited the park office, and I could see in her eyes that she, too, was haunted by the past. Every time I mentioned Walt's disappearance, she would avert her gaze, as if the very subject were a taboo too painful to confront. The nights grew colder and the mist thicker, and with each passing day the Banshee's presence became more tangible. I began to notice things that I couldn't explain. Doors in my RV left open, personal items rearranged, and that mournful cry echoing in the dead of night. I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but the weight of the supernatural events pressed down on me relentlessly. the line between reality and nightmare blurred, and I found myself questioning whether I was truly alone in this cursed place. One night, as I sat at my desk typing up my latest findings, the power flickered and then went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, the beam slicing through the blackness, and that's when I heard it. A quiet, desperate tapping at the window. I approached cautiously, my breath catching in my throat. Outside, pressed against the glass, was the pale face of the banshee, her eyes glimmering with sorrow and something else, an almost pleading look. I could see no malice in her expression, only the profound sadness of a life robbed of peace. In that moment, I understood that the banshee was not simply a harbinger of doom, but a victim of a long-forgotten tragedy. I resolved that I would honor her memory by exposing the truth behind the dark events that had haunted Cedar Lake for over a century. My hands trembled as I recorded everything in my journal. Every eerie detail, every whisper in the night, and every glimpse of that spectral figure. The following morning, I set out to retrace Walt's steps, hoping to find any sign of his fate. I made my way to the shoreline, where the diary and local records hinted he might have gone. The lake was calm, its surface a mirror reflecting the overcast sky. I called out for him, but only the soft lapping of water and a distant, mournful cry answered. I scoured the banks, finding nothing but scattered pebbles and the faint imprint of footprints that vanished into the reeds. It was as if Walt had been swallowed by the very mist that now haunted the park. Returning to Silent Pines, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by human eyes, but by something ancient and sorrowful. That night, as I sat in the dim light of my RV, I heard Mary's soft knock on the door. When I opened it, she stood there, eyes brimming with unshed tears, and whispered, "There are things you don't understand, Sam. Some secrets are better left buried." Before I could ask her to explain, she vanished into the night, leaving me with a cold chill and an overwhelming sense of foreboding. I continued my work, driven by a need to give voice to the banshee's long-forgotten tragedy. Every night, her mournful wails and fleeting appearances pushed me closer to the edge of fear, yet also closer to the truth. I documented every encounter meticulously, blending the cold facts of history with the raw, unfiltered terror of the present. In the quiet solitude of my RV, I began to see that the boundaries between the living and the dead were more permeable than I had ever imagined. On one final rain-soaked night, I ventured once more to the lake's edge. The mist was thicker than ever, and the world around me seemed to blur into a surreal tapestry of shadows and light. I set up a small recorder determined to capture any final message the banshee might offer. As I waited, the air grew so still it was as if time itself were holding its breath. Then, emerging from the swirling fog, she appeared. The crying widow stood at the water's edge, her tattered white dress clinging to her emaciated frame, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to encompass every injustice of the past. I stepped forward slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. "I'm here," I said, voice trembling. "I want to help. Tell me your story." The banshee's eyes met mine, and for a moment the world fell silent. I felt an indescribable sorrow flow from her, a pain so deep it resonated with every word I had read and every tear I had shed. In that haunting silence, her spectral form seemed to shimmer, and I heard her voice, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves and distant weeping. Her words weren't clear, but they carried the weight of betrayal, injustice, and a plea for recognition. I recorded every moment, every nuance of her silent agony, knowing that this was the key to unlocking the mystery that had gripped Cedar Lake for generations. I promised her, with every fiber of my being, that her truth would be told. and as if in answer, the banshee's form began to dissolve into the mist, her final, sorrowful wail lingering long after she had vanished from sight. I returned to my RV, drenched by the relentless rain and the raw emotion of that encounter. In the days that followed, I poured every detail into my manuscript, blending historical records, eyewitness accounts, and my own harrowing experiences. I reached out to local historians and scoured old newspapers, determined to piece together the puzzle of the crying widow. I learned that her death had been shrouded in scandal, a cover-up orchestrated by those in power to protect their own interests. Her story, long silenced, was finally coming to light through my words. Yet, even as I began to share my findings with the world, an unsettling feeling persisted. I never learned what had become of Walt, and Mary's cryptic warnings continued to echo in my mind. Every now and then, in the quiet moments of the night, I still hear that distant mournful cry over Cedar Lake, a reminder that some spirits never truly rest, and that the past, with all its secrets and tragedies, is never far behind. I now live with the knowledge that I have unearthed a piece of history that many would prefer remain hidden, and that in doing so, I have become part of a larger, haunting narrative. My memoir is not just a recounting of personal healing and discovery, it is a testament to the enduring power of truth and the restless souls who demand to be remembered. And as I sit here, pen in hand, I can still feel the weight of that sorrowful presence, as if the crying widow herself is watching from the misty edges of my memory, urging me to continue, to never let her story be forgotten. The nights at Silent Pines may have ended, but the echoes of Cedar Lake's tragic past remain with me. I have learned that sometimes the greatest stories are not those of human triumph, but the quiet, relentless voices of those who have suffered injustice. I honor them by keeping their memories alive, even as the darkness of their past lingers in every shadow and every whisper of the wind. My name is Eli Matthews. I am 29. This happened at Blackwater Ridge RV Park, on the fringes of the Big Cypress National Preserve in southwestern Florida. After a painful breakup and months of urban chaos that left me questioning who I really was, I decided to buy a modest RV and escape to solitude. I hoped that in the oppressive humidity and long, shadowed nights of the Florida wilderness, I'd find the inspiration to finish my novel, and perhaps even some healing. When I pulled into Blackwater Ridge, the RV park's isolation hit me immediately. There were only a handful of other RVs scattered among overgrown fields and swampy patches. The park itself felt almost abandoned, the buildings weathered by time and the relentless Florida sun. I parked my RV on a small gravel lot tucked away from the main area, determined to enjoy the privacy I so desperately craved. My first encounter came on a hot afternoon when I was unloading some boxes. Derek Jones, the park's maintenance man, ambled over. He was a rugged man in his mid-40s, his skin tanned and lined with years of hard work outdoors. With a curt nod, he said, "Welcome to Blackwater Ridge. Just keep your eyes open at night. Things walk these parts after dark that don't belong here." I couldn't tell if he was joking or warning me, but something in his gravelly tone made me pause. Later that day, I stopped by the small park office for a map and some basic info about the area. There, I met Nina Ramirez, the park operator. Nina was 33, with kind eyes and a warm smile that belied a subtle tension. When I casually asked if there were any local legends I should know about, she hesitated for a moment before replying, "There's talk about a creature. Some folks call it the Shifter. They say it can take on the face of anyone it wants. But honestly, it's probably just stories from old-timers." I smiled politely. though I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that there was more to her words than she was willing to admit. That first night, I settled into my RV with the quiet determination of a writer ready to capture solitude on paper. The interior was cool and dimly lit by a single lamp. I set up my laptop and tried to concentrate on a new chapter, but the oppressive silence outside was punctuated by soft, almost imperceptible sounds. A rustling in the undergrowth. Distant, indistinct whispers carried on the humid breeze. I first noticed something odd around midnight when I stepped outside for a cigarette. The air was heavy with moisture, and a low murmur of voices, if voices they were, seemed to drift among the trees. I shrugged it off as the wind through the palms, but then I caught sight of something that made my heart skip a beat. In the reflection of a dark window of a neighboring RV, I saw a figure standing in the shadows that looked exactly like me. For a split second, I stared at the shape. A man with my build, my dark hair, even the way I carried myself, before it melted back into the darkness. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was simply tired and on edge in a strange place. Over the next few days, the unsettling signs multiplied. I'd find my personal items rearranged, my notebook here, my favorite pen there, as if someone had rifled through my RV. At night, I began to hear soft, urgent whispers outside, and sometimes I'd glimpse a figure moving just at the edge of my vision. I mentioned these occurrences to Derek when I bumped into him by the fuel pump. He only grunted and said, "People say sometimes the wrong folks show up here. Best keep your wits about you." Meanwhile, Nina offered sympathetic but vague comments whenever I inquired about what might be happening. There are old stories about a creature that can wear a man's face as easily as a mask, she said quietly, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. They say it preys on the lonely, on those who think they're safe out here by themselves. I tried to focus on my writing, but the eerie experiences were impossible to ignore. Then, one humid evening, as I was taking a late-night walk to clear my mind, I encountered something that shattered my remaining sense of normalcy. Stumbling along a narrow path near the edge of the RV park, I caught sight of a man standing motionless in the distance. He was dressed exactly as I was that night. A faded t-shirt and jeans, and he faced away from me as if he were waiting. I called out hesitantly, "Hey, are you all right?" The figure turned slowly, and I froze. His eyes gleamed in the darkness with an unnatural light, and in that moment, I knew without a doubt that I was looking at my own face staring back at me. The double grinned, a twisted mirror image of my own uncertain smile, before vanishing into the tangled undergrowth. The dread that clutched my heart was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My mind raced. Was it a hallucination? Was I losing it? Or was something truly stalking me, using my own face as a guise to torment me? I tried to confide in my old friend Mark, a voice from my past whom I had trusted implicitly. We had been inseparable once upon a time, sharing secrets and dreams before life pulled us in different directions. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but I decided to call him from my RV phone, hoping for reassurance. His voice, however, sounded strained and oddly detached. He said he'd been in the area on business and that he might stop by. When he finally arrived one evening, I welcomed him warmly, relieved to see a familiar face amid the growing madness. But something was off about Mark. Over the course of the evening, I noticed subtle changes, a glimmer in his eyes that wasn't his own, a way he mimicked my gestures almost too perfectly. At first, I chalked it up to our long separation and the awkwardness of reconnecting, but soon his behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began to insist that I leave Blackwater Ridge immediately, hinting that I was in danger. "They're coming for you," he whispered one night, his voice barely audible. "You can't trust anyone here, especially me." I dismissed it as drunken rambling, but his words stuck in my mind like a splinter. My suspicions deepened when, a week into my stay, one of the other RV residents, a quiet man known for his friendly demeanor, vanished in broad daylight. Rumors spread quickly among the remaining campers. Some said they'd seen him walking with a vacant expression, his face slack and unseeing, moments before he disappeared into the swamp. Others claimed they'd heard his voice calling for help in a distorted, otherworldly tone. The whispers among the campers grew, and soon enough it became clear that something unnatural was at work. Late one night, I awoke to the sound of a knock on my RV door. Bleary-eyed, I shuffled to the door and opened it, expecting perhaps another concerned camper. Instead, standing in the doorway was Mark, his face half in shadow. His eyes shone with a strange, hungry intensity that made my blood run cold. "Eli," he said in a low, measured tone, "you have to come with me. Now." I wanted to ask him what was wrong, but his words froze in my throat. Before I could react, Mark lunged at me. In the ensuing struggle, my world spun into chaos. I managed to break free, stumbling backward as he disappeared into the night with a snarl. Whether he'd been taken over by something or was colluding with it, I couldn't tell. But the betrayal cut deep. That same night, I began receiving anonymous notes slipped under my RV door. Their messages were cryptic. "Don't trust the mirror," "Your friend wears a mask," and "Leave now before the shifter takes your soul." The words stirred a terror inside me that was more psychological than physical. Every time I caught my reflection, I wondered if it was truly mine, or if it was the creature masquerading as me. Desperate for answers, I turned once more to Derek and Nina. Derek, though gruff, admitted in a low voice that locals had long whispered about the skinwalker, called the shifter, by those who had encountered it. "They say it takes on the face of those it kills or torments," he confided. "It sows distrust, drives a man mad with fear of his own shadow." Nina, eyes filled with worry, recalled the day she'd lost a dear friend to the creature's influence. "We don't know why it targets people like you," she said softly, "but it thrives on isolation and self-doubt." I resolved then to confront the terror head-on. One sweltering, moonless night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a determination fueled by mounting paranoia, I ventured away from the safety of my RV. I walked along a narrow, winding path that led into the marshes surrounding the park. The humid air pressed in on me, and the sound of dripping water mixed with the distant chorus of nocturnal creatures. Every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge, every shifting shadow a potential imposter. As I trekked deeper into the marsh, I suddenly heard a soft voice calling my name, a voice that sounded achingly like mine. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to locate its source. Out of the swirling mist emerged a figure, tall and indistinct. For a moment, I couldn't tell if it was a man or a trick of the fog, but as the figure drew closer, I recognized my own features mirrored in its face. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was face to face with my doppelganger, a perfect, unnatural copy of myself. It smiled, a grin that was both familiar and utterly alien, and then it spoke in my own voice, "Eli, come with me." In that moment, the boundary between reality and nightmare blurred completely. I fought back with every ounce of strength, stumbling away in a desperate bid to escape the creature that was using my face to infiltrate my life. The voice behind me, my own voice, distorted and mocking, followed as the doppelganger melted back into the fog. I ran blindly, the oppressive humid air filling my lungs, and I could only think of one thing. I had to warn the others and I had to get out before the skinwalker claimed any more of us. I returned to the RV park in a state of panic. Mark was nowhere to be found, and my trust in anyone was shattered by his earlier betrayal. I gathered Derek and Nina, recounting my experience in halting, breathless whispers. Together, we pieced together what little we could. A creature that preyed on isolation and exploited our deepest vulnerabilities by assuming our identities. We speculated that Mark's sudden, desperate actions were not entirely his own. That perhaps he had been taken over by the shifter, or worse, had willingly allied with it for reasons I could not fathom. Determined to put an end to the terror, we formed a plan. Derek, with his intimate knowledge of the land, led us toward an area in the marshes where locals claimed unexplained tracks and eerie sounds had been reported for years. Nina provided what little historical context she could muster. Stories of missing campers, inexplicable disappearances, and whispered legends of a shapeshifter that once roamed these wetlands long before the park existed. As we ventured into the dark labyrinth of the Everglades under a canopy of twisted trees and thick, choking mist, every sound became a threat. The swamp seemed to breathe around us, and the moist air carried a faint, unidentifiable odor of decay and earth. Our flashlights barely pierced the gloom, and every rustle in the underbrush sent our hearts into overdrive. We finally arrived at a clearing that Derek insisted was the creature's lair. The ground was churned up and muddy, with scattered tracks that defied any natural explanation. I felt a sinking dread as I examined them. They were my own footprints intermingled with larger, claw-like impressions. My mind reeled with the possibility that somewhere in that dark expanse, the skinwalker was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Before we could discuss our next move, a sudden, bone-chilling cry shattered the oppressive silence. It was Mark, if it was really him, screaming in agony from somewhere within the marsh. Without hesitation, we rushed toward the sound. I felt my stomach clench as we navigated through the murky water and tangled vegetation. Every step an exercise in both fear and determination. In a small clearing, we found him, or at least a figure that resembled him. He was slumped against a tree, his eyes wide with terror, his face contorted in pain. But as I approached, I noticed something deeply wrong. His features were distorted, his skin pale and shifting, as if his very identity were melting away. "Eli!" he gasped, his voice wavering between his own and something unrecognizable. "I'm sorry, I never meant to let it in." Then, before we could react, he convulsed violently, his body spasming as though some inner force was tearing him apart. In the chaos, Nina tried to reach him, but the creature's influence seemed to surge from within him. In a blink, he was gone, dragged off into the darkness by a force we couldn't see, leaving behind only a scattering of torn clothing and the echo of his final, anguished cry. I sank to my knees, overcome by a mixture of grief and fury. The betrayal stung deeply. Not only had the skinwalker impersonated me and invaded my sense of self, but someone I once called a friend had been manipulated, or perhaps willingly complicit in its terror. The weight of isolation, of being preyed upon by something that knew my every vulnerability, nearly broke me. Derek and Nina helped me back to the path, their eyes reflecting a grim resolve. We retreated slowly from the clearing, the oppressive darkness of the marsh closing in behind us. Every step felt like a descent deeper into a nightmare that refused to end. The sound of distant, mocking laughter, my own laughter twisted into a grotesque mimicry, haunted the space between us. Back at Blackwater Ridge, the RV park felt forever changed. The once quiet, secluded haven was now a place of distrust and whispered warnings. I could no longer look at my reflection without shuddering. fearing that the creature might be waiting just behind the glass. I locked my RV door at night, and every creak of the wood or gust of humid wind sent me into a state of alert. In the days that followed, Derek and Nina did what they could to shore up a semblance of normalcy among the remaining campers, but the terror had already taken root. I spent long, sleepless nights trying to gather my scattered thoughts and piece together what had happened, all the while haunted by the sense that the skinwalker was still out there, watching, waiting, ready to wear my face or someone else's at any moment. I began to document every detail in a battered notebook, desperate to capture the truth behind the nightmare. I wrote about the quiet moments of dread, the subtle rearrangements of my belongings, the inexplicable notes that warned me away, and, most haunting of all, the countless moments when I saw my own face in the shadows. I detailed the betrayal of a friend and the horrific disappearance that shattered what little trust remained in this isolated place. My words became both a confession and a desperate plea for understanding, a way to hold on to my identity even as the creature threatened to erase it. Now, as I sit in my RV, the hum of an old air conditioner the only sound in a still, humid night, I know that I have not seen the last of the skinwalker. Its presence lingers in every dark corner of Blackwater Ridge, in every whispered rumor exchanged between frightened campers. The terror it instilled has changed me irreversibly. I no longer sleep without double-checking every lock, and every time I catch a glimpse of movement outside my window, my heart races in anticipation of my own reflection returning to haunt me. I've learned that isolation can be a double-edged sword. What I once thought would bring solace and creative inspiration has instead exposed me to the raw, unfiltered darkness that lies beneath the surface of both human nature and the wild, unforgiving landscape of this place. The skinwalker, with its ability to mimic and deceive, has shown me that the line between who we are and who we fear to become is frighteningly thin. I continue to write, each word a testament to my struggle to reclaim my identity and confront the horror that nearly consumed me. And as I look out into the inky blackness beyond my RV, I cannot help but wonder if, somewhere in the swirling mists of the marsh, a figure moves silently, its eyes aglow with that unholy light, a constant, lingering reminder that the shifter is still out there, waiting for the moment to step into the light once more. Every so often, when the wind is just right and the night is especially dark, I think I hear a whisper, a voice that sounds like my own, laced with a warning and a promise. And I know that in this lonely, haunted corner of Florida, the terror of the skinwalker will never truly be banished. My name is Isabel Moore. I am 37. This happened at Lakeside Hollow RV Park near the Suwannee River in North Florida. After losing my husband in a sudden accident, I found myself drowning in grief and unable to bear the suffocating memories of our old life. Desperate for solace and the promise of a new beginning, I traded our small apartment for a modest RV and set out to a quiet retreat called Lakeside Hollow RV Park. I envisioned peaceful days filled with reflection by the river and nights spent writing down my emotions, hoping that time and isolation would heal the gaping wound inside me. When I arrived, the park's isolation was immediately palpable. A few weathered RVs lay scattered among overgrown lawns, and the dense forest crept up to the edge of the Suwannee River like a dark secret. I parked my RV on a small gravel lot away from the few other campers, seeking privacy and a safe haven for my fragile heart. The humid air was heavy, and the distant, constant murmur of the river became my first companion in this new chapter of solitude. On my first evening after settling in, I ventured into the park's small diner for dinner. There, I met Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly woman with kind, knowing eyes and a gentle smile that seemed to carry a lifetime of stories. Over a cup of lukewarm coffee, She shared local lore with a quiet melancholy. In hushed tones, she spoke of a tragic legend, the White Bride. According to her, the spirit of a young bride, murdered on her wedding day and abandoned by fate, now haunted the banks of the Suwannee River. Her sorrowful cries could be heard on humid nights, and some swore they had seen her wandering in a tattered white dress, weeping for the life she'd lost. Mrs. Evelyn's voice wavered as she warned, "Some spirits, dear, are fueled by sorrow so deep that they reach out to the living. They sometimes demand more than just remembrance." I listened, both comforted and unnerved by her words, though I tried to convince myself that such tales were nothing more than old superstitions meant to scare children. The first few nights passed in a strange mix of melancholy and occasional unease. I spent hours at my small writing desk in the RV, trying to transmute my grief into words. But as darkness fell, I began to notice peculiar happenings that I couldn't ignore. One night, while I was jotting down a painful memory of my late husband, I glanced up and caught a glimpse of movement outside my window. In the dim light, a figure in a white dress drifted along the riverbank. I blinked hard, certain it was my tired imagination, yet the soft weeping that echoed faintly on the breeze was unmistakable. Another evening, I discovered that objects in my RV, photos of happier times, my favorite mug, had been moved to different places, as if someone had rifled through my belongings. My heart pounded with both fear and sorrow at the thought of being haunted by memories of my past, or perhaps something else entirely. Determined to understand these disturbances, I began frequenting the diner, seeking more clues from Mrs. Evelyn. One rainy afternoon, as I sipped tea and scribbled notes in a worn journal, she leaned closer and said, "They say the White Bride is not merely a lost soul, but a cry for justice, a spirit betrayed and forgotten. And sometimes, when her sorrow is too deep, she reaches out for someone who is already in pain." Her eyes, clouded with regret, met mine. I tried to laugh it off, but inside I felt a cold chill, as if I had unwittingly invited something dark into my sanctuary. A few days later, my long-lost friend Lydia called. I hadn't spoken with her since the wedding, and I welcomed the sound of a familiar voice. She suggested that we meet at the park's community picnic area, a chance to catch up and for me to step a little further out of my shell. Lydia arrived with an easy smile and an infectious warmth that momentarily eased the loneliness gnawing at me. We spent the afternoon reminiscing about old times and exploring the scenic trails by the river. For a few hours, I allowed myself to be vulnerable, enjoying the comfort of companionship. Yet, even as Lydia's laughter filled the air, I sensed an undercurrent of something unspoken. There were moments when her eyes would darken inexplicably, and she'd cast furtive glances at the forest edge or lower her voice when the topic of local legends arose. I tried to dismiss these signs as the residue of her own struggles, but a persistent unease began to gnaw at me. Late one humid evening, as I returned from a solitary walk along the river, I noticed a group of shadowy figures lingering near the edge of the park. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, and their murmurs were unintelligible. I shrugged it off as a gathering of locals, but later, while passing by the diner, I overheard snippets of a conversation that made my blood run cold. A few of the patrons mentioned a secret cult, a group that worshipped the spirit of the White Bride. They whispered that the cult believed the ghost's tragic death demanded a sacrifice, a living soul consumed by grief to fully awaken her power and bring retribution upon those who had wronged her. My mind reeled with conflicting emotions. I had come here to heal, yet it seemed that my sorrow might have marked me as the perfect target for such dark rituals. The thought haunted me as I returned to my RV that night. I double-checked the locks and sat by the window staring out into the oppressive darkness, my heart heavy with foreboding. The following morning, I found Lydia waiting for me outside my RV, her expression unusually somber. She invited me to join her for a walk, and though I hesitated, I accepted, yearning for the comfort of familiar company. As we strolled along the riverbank, the conversation grew strained. I could sense that Lydia was wrestling with something she wasn't ready to say. Finally, in a hushed voice, she confessed, "Isabel, there's something you need to know about this place. I've been involved with a group here, a cult, if you will. They believe that the White Bride's spirit can be awakened to exact vengeance on those who wronged her. And they believe that you, with all your pain, might be the one to complete the ritual." I stopped dead in my tracks. Lydia's eyes pleaded for forgiveness, but the shock and betrayal left me reeling. "Why would you do this?" I managed to choke out. She looked away, tears welling in her eyes. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was desperate for meaning after losing so much, and I got caught up in their promises. I'm so sorry." Her confession was like a knife twisting in my heart. The friend I had once trusted, the one I had turned to for solace, now appeared to be a harbinger of doom. That same night, as a thunder rumbled in the distance and the humid air pressed against my skin, I heard the sound of hurried footsteps and muffled voices outside my RV. I opened the door a crack and peered out into the darkness. Before I could react, a pair of strong arms clamped around me, and I was dragged out into the night. Masked figures in dark clothing surrounded me, their faces hidden, their voices low and menacing. I struggled, screaming for help, but the humid air swallowed my cries. I was thrown into the back of a van, and everything went black. When I came to, I found myself in a cold, dimly lit room within an abandoned mansion deep in the forest. The air was stale and heavy with the scent of decay. I was tied to a rickety wooden chair, and the distant sound of chanting filled the corridors. My heart pounded as I realized that I was the intended sacrifice, the living embodiment of grief meant to serve as a conduit for the White Bride's wrath. I could see cult members gathered in a large, candlelit chamber, their voices rising in a low, droning chant. At the center of the room, a crude altar had been set up, adorned with withered flowers and faded ribbons that hinted at lost celebrations. I strained against my bonds, desperate to free myself, but the ropes bit into my wrists, and terror threatened to overwhelm me. As the chanting grew louder, the air in the chamber shifted. A cold wind seemed to sweep through the room, extinguishing some of the candles and casting long, quivering shadows on the walls. I could hardly believe my eyes when, at the far end of the chamber, a spectral figure began to materialize. Draped in a tattered white dress, her face pallid and marked with eternal sorrow, the White Bride emerged from the darkness. Her eyes, filled with grief and a longing for justice, swept over the gathered cult members. For a moment, the room fell silent, as if the very air held its breath. The cultists' chanting faltered, and then chaos erupted. Screams mingled with shouts, and in the confusion I saw my chance. With a surge of adrenaline born from pure terror, I wrenched myself free enough to break a loose rope and struggled to my feet. The White Bride's mournful wail echoed through the chamber, a sound so laden with anguish that it shattered the cult's trance. I did not wait to understand if her presence was meant to protect me or to exact her own twisted form of justice. I ran. I bolted through the dark corridors of the mansion, the sound of frenzied footsteps and panicked shouts chasing me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I navigated the labyrinthine hallways, the only guide my desperate determination to escape. Every door I tried led to more darkness and uncertainty, until finally I burst through a heavy, creaking door into the cool night air of the forest. Rain began to fall, cold and unrelenting, washing away the remnants of fear and blood on my skin. I ran through the undergrowth, my heart pounding with a mix of terror and hope, until I eventually found a narrow trail leading back towards the direction of Lakeside Hollow. The forest loomed around me, each rustle and snap of a branch a reminder that danger still lurked in the shadows. My limbs ached, and my mind was numb with shock, but I pushed forward relentlessly. Hours later, soaked and trembling, I finally reached the RV park. The familiar murmur of the Suwannee River was a bittersweet sound, a reminder of both solace and sorrow. I collapsed onto a bench near the parking lot, trying to catch my breath and process the night's horrors. The park was eerily quiet now. I sensed that something had shifted, that the darkness had receded just enough for the survivors to tend to their own wounds. In the days that followed, I remained at Lakeside Hollow, too terrified to leave and too haunted to return to my old life. I often found myself sitting by the river, watching the water flow in endless, silent rhythms, and waiting for a glimpse of that spectral white dress. I learned later that the cult had dispersed into the forest, their plans foiled by the unexpected intervention of the White Bride herself. Lydia was nowhere to be found. Her betrayal and her involvement with the cult remained an unresolved, painful mystery. Every night, as I sat in my RV, I would hear the soft, mournful weeping carried by the wind from the riverbank, and sometimes I would catch a fleeting glimpse of a woman in a tattered white dress drifting along the water's edge. The boundaries between my grief and the ghost's sorrow began to blur. I wondered if, in some inexplicable way, the tragedy of the White Bride and my own loss were intertwined. A shared pain that could never truly be laid to rest. I began to document everything in a battered journal, a chronicle of my descent into terror and the strange encounters that had upended my life. My writing became both an act of survival and a desperate attempt to understand the forces that had invaded my solitude. I detailed every eerie occurrence, every whispered warning from Mrs. Evelyn at the diner, and every memory of my husband that made the specter of the White Bride seem all the more real. Now, as I sit here in the dim light of my RV on another humid night, I still feel the weight of that fateful encounter. The Suwannee River flows silently by, its surface shimmering with reflections of moonlight and shadows. I know that I have survived something that has forever changed me, that I have seen a fragment of a sorrowful past that will haunt my dreams for years to come. I do not know whether the White Bride is a force for justice or an unending curse, but her presence lingers in every quiet moment and every whisper of the wind. I have learned that grief is a powerful, unyielding force, one that can open doors to darkness when we are most vulnerable. Though I continue to heal slowly, the memory of that night and the spectral figure in white remain etched in my soul. And sometimes, when the night is especially still and the river sings its mournful song, I swear I see her standing at the water's edge, a silent sentinel of lost love and unhealed wounds, reminding me that some ghosts and some sorrows never truly fade away. My name is Rob Carter. I am 42. This happened at Devil's Pass RV Park, on the outskirts of the Apalachicola National Forest in North Florida. After my discharge from the Marines, I was left with memories I couldn't shake, and a guilt that clung to me like a second skin. I needed to get away from the ghosts of war and start over somewhere quiet, somewhere the past wouldn't follow me. Devil's Pass RV Park seemed to promise that kind of isolation, a forgotten stretch near an abandoned highway diner, swallowed slowly by encroaching wilderness and endless fog. I hauled my battered RV into a gravel lot tucked on the edge of the park, determined to find solace and maybe a path to redemption. The first night was stiflingly humid, and the oppressive silence was punctuated only by distant, muffled murmurs and the constant lapping sound of rain on metal. As I lay in the cramped interior of my RV, I found it hard to sleep. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of a light in the thick fog rolling over the parking lot, a flicker that seemed out of place. I chalked it up to faulty street lamps, or perhaps a truck long gone, but as the nights wore on, that image became harder to dismiss. On my second evening, while checking my gear outside, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Between the skeletal remains of old highway signs and rusted billboards, a dim, swinging light appeared far off in the fog. It wasn't a truck headlamp or a passing car, it was an old lantern, its flame dancing erratically as if buffeted by an unseen wind. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. The following morning, I decided to ask around. I made my way to a small, weathered building that served as the park office. There, I met Deputy Dawson, a grizzled, no-nonsense officer from the nearby town. He eyed me over thick glasses and said in a low, gravelly voice, "You're new here, aren't you? Just a word of advice, son. There's legends about these parts. Folks talk about a demon called the Devil's Lantern. They say it preys on men burdened by their pasts." His tone wasn't mocking. It was a serious warning that made me shiver despite the midday heat. Not long after, I encountered Mr. Harlan, a reclusive local who lived on the fringes of the park. He was a lean, taciturn man with deep-set eyes that seemed to have witnessed too much. "You'd do well to stay indoors after dark," he muttered, when I asked about strange lights and sounds. "There's darkness here that plays tricks on your mind." Though his words were cryptic, I sensed an undercurrent of dread in his voice. I couldn't tell if he truly believed in what he was saying or if he was hiding something far more sinister. That night, alone in my RV, the uneasy feeling that had been creeping up on me turned into a full-blown nightmare. As I tried to sleep, vivid hallucinations invaded my dreams. Images of my fallen comrades, faces twisted with regret, and flashes of past military failures that I had spent years trying to bury. At one point, I awoke to see, for just a moment, my own reflection in the small window of my RV. But it wasn't my reflection. The figure looked haunted, its eyes burning with a fury that mirrored my own internal torment. And behind it, I could just make out the dim glow of that old lantern swinging in the darkness. Over the next several nights, the appearances became more frequent. I'd be out for a walk around the park trying to clear my head, and there, in the peripheral vision of my flashlight's beam, I'd see that flickering light again. It seemed to be drawing me toward the forest. At times, I heard distant whispers that sounded like my own voice, echoing memories I wished I could forget. The line between reality and the demons in my head began to blur. One particularly foggy night, I followed the pull of that spectral light. The moon was hidden behind a thick shroud of clouds, and the only illumination came from sporadic, flickering glows. I left the relative safety of my RV and ventured into the forest, my heart pounding in my chest. Every step felt like I was descending deeper into a trap set by my own guilt. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps and the whisper of the wind were all I could hear, until the light emerged again. It hung in the air like a beacon, suspended by some malevolent force. I reached out as if to grab it, but it drifted away, leading me along a narrow, overgrown path. Memories of combat, of decisions made in haste, flashed before my eyes. I felt my chest tighten with regret and remorse. The lantern seemed to mock me, its flame dancing in rhythm with my racing heartbeat. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, but the darkness offered no clear shape. My pulse quickened as I sensed I wasn't alone. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the heavy, humid air. Then a figure stepped into the meager beam of my flashlight. It was Mr. Harlan. His eyes were unnervingly vacant, and his usually stoic expression was marred by something darker. "Follow the light," he said in a hushed tone that sent a chill down my spine. "It knows the way." I hesitated, a surge of suspicion stirring inside me. His guidance felt more like a command, a lure into the depths of the forest where the air grew colder and the shadows longer. Reluctantly, I continued along the path with Mr. Harlan leading the way. As we moved deeper, the hallucinations intensified. I saw visions of my past, moments of failure, lost comrades, and the overwhelming burden of guilt that I'd carried since leaving the service. At times, the line between memory and nightmare dissolved completely. I could hear the anguished cries of voices long gone, and the lantern's glow became almost hypnotic. Then, as we neared the ruins of an old, abandoned roadside diner, the true horror of the night unfolded. The building stood half swallowed by nature, its windows dark and broken. The lantern's light led us right to its rotting door. Before I could protest, Mr. Harlan pushed me inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, broken only by the intermittent flashes of the lantern's light that seeped through cracks in the walls. Inside, I was overcome by a profound sense of dread. The air was thick with decay and something unidentifiably malevolent. I struggled against the bonds of my own terror as visions began to assault me. Horrific scenes of the past reimagined before my eyes. I saw myself alone and condemned, reliving every painful mistake, every decision that had led me to this cursed place. The demon of the lantern had found its mark. At the heart of the diner, in a small, dilapidated room, I was forced to confront the truth. The flickering lantern now hovered in the air, and its light took on a sinister, almost tangible quality. The air grew icy, and I could see the shape of a spectral figure emerging from the swirling mists. A creature cloaked in shadows, with ember-like eyes that pierced through me. This was the demon of Devil's Lantern. It whispered in a voice that was both familiar and monstrous, dredging up the darkest corners of my mind. It taunted me with images of failure and loss, playing on my deepest fears and regrets. In that moment, as the demon's illusions threatened to consume me, I realized that I could not let it win. The weight of my past, the guilt and the sorrow, had driven me to seek redemption in isolation. But now, they were being weaponized against me. With every ounce of strength I had left, I fought back. I screamed, lashing out at the apparitions with desperate determination. I tore my eyes away from the hallucinations, focusing on the reality of my situation. I was in an abandoned diner, captured by a force that sought to shatter my very soul. It was then that I heard a shout, a voice cutting through the chaos. Deputy Dawson had tracked me down. The sound of his voice, gruff and commanding, anchored me in the present. Amid the swirling terror, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Harlan. His eyes, once cold and distant, now burned with a deranged intensity. It was then I understood. Harlan had been guiding me not to save me, but to fulfill the demon's design. He had allowed me to be led into this trap, his own will consumed by the dark influence of the Devil's Lantern. In the ensuing struggle, the boundaries between illusion and reality shattered completely. I fought with every fiber of my being against the spectral force that sought to drag me into eternal torment. The demon's lantern swung wildly, its light casting grotesque, shifting shadows on the crumbling walls. I could feel the demon's presence gnawing at the edges of my mind, dredging up every hidden shame and regret. But the sound of Deputy Dawson's voice, stern and unwavering, gave me a lifeline. "Rob, you've got to fight it," he bellowed. bursting into the room with a determination born of years of confronting the unexplainable. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I realized that I had to face not only this monstrous apparition, but also the inner demons that had haunted me for years. I reached deep within myself, summoning every ounce of strength and willpower I possessed. With a cry that was equal parts defiance and despair, I turned my gaze directly at the lantern's flame. The demon shrieked, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the very fabric of the room. The light flickered wildly, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I saw a vision of my past, the faces of the men I'd lost, the chaos of combat, and the regret that had festered ever since. But then, like a beacon, I forced myself to focus on the present. I thought of the man I wanted to become, a man free of his past, capable of redemption. My inner resolve, honed by years of surviving the worst that life had to offer, flared up. In that climactic moment, as if struck by the force of my determination, the demon's hold began to waver. The spectral figure staggered, and the lantern's light dimmed, its malevolent glow flickering as if on the verge of being snuffed out. Mr. Harlan, now revealed to be a puppet of the dark force, staggered back, his eyes vacant and unseeing as the demon's influence over him ebbed away. Deputy Dawson didn't wait. He moved quickly, rounding on Harlan, and with a firm grip and a few choice words, he restrained the man, who now slumped in defeated resignation. I took advantage of the moment. With trembling limbs, I broke free from the psychological shackles that had bound me and bolted from the ruined diner into the night. The forest loomed dark and indifferent as I ran, my breath ragged and my mind a tumult of memories and pain. I could still hear the distant, dying echo of the demon's laugh, and the flicker of that damned lantern haunted my every step. Eventually, I found my way back to Devil's Pass RV Park. The fog had lifted slightly, and the oppressive weight of the night seemed to recede just enough for me to catch my breath. Deputy Dawson was waiting, his stern expression softening as he helped me into my RV. In the aftermath, law enforcement scoured the area. They found bizarre evidence, a set of footprints that vanished into the fog, the remnants of a burnt old lantern near the diner's ruins, but no definitive explanation. The local legends, it seemed, remained as elusive as ever. In the weeks that followed, I stayed at the park, unable to shake the memories of that night. I knew deep down that the demon's lantern might be dormant for now, but I also understood that the darkness it represented would forever be a part of me. I spent countless sleepless nights wrestling with my inner demons, haunted by visions of the spectral light and the faces of those I'd lost. My journey toward redemption had taken an unexpected turn, a descent into a realm where guilt and supernatural terror intertwined. I began writing down every detail in a battered journal, a desperate attempt to exorcise both the literal and figurative demons that had stalked me. I wrote about the oppressive fog, the chilling whispers in the darkness, and the overwhelming terror that had nearly consumed me. Each word was a small act of defiance against the darkness, a pledge to reclaim my life from the grip of past regrets. Now, as I sit in my RV on a humid, stifling night, I still feel the weight of that encounter. The memory of the flickering lantern and the demonic presence lingers in the corners of my mind. I know that the devil's lantern may one day reappear, preying on another soul burdened by guilt. And while I've found a measure of solace in my survival, I also know that some scars never truly fade. They serve as a constant reminder that redemption is a lifelong struggle, and that the demons we carry, both within and without, can resurface when we least expect it. Every so often, when the fog rolls in and the night grows unnervingly still, I catch a glimpse of a faint, swinging light in the distance, a silent, chilling promise that the past is never truly gone. And I wonder if, somewhere in that darkness, the demon is waiting, biding its time until it can once again exploit the fragile human heart. For now, I keep moving forward, scarred but not defeated, forever wary of the thin line between the light of redemption and the shadows of despair. My name is Mark Ellison. I am 50. This happened at Silver Cypress RV Park, on the outskirts of Tallahassee, North Florida. After I left behind a high-powered corporate career and a bitter divorce that left me with more regrets than memories of love, I sought refuge in solitude. I thought that retreating to an isolated RV park might help me rebuild the fragments of my life. Silver Cypress. RV Park promised quiet, an expanse of weathered RVs nestled against an ancient cypress forest whose twisted limbs and hanging moss whispered secrets of a long-forgotten past. I parked my old rig in a quiet corner of the park, determined to leave my burdens behind and embrace a fresh start. The park was unremarkable during the day. A cluster of faded trailers, a few dusty picnic tables, and the occasional hum of a passing car on an old, seldom-used road. But as dusk fell, the humid air grew heavy, and the forest presence seemed to seep into every corner. I could feel an unsettling energy settle over the place, and even the wind seemed to carry distant, mournful howls that I couldn't quite place. That first night, as I sat on the back steps of my RV trying to calm my restless thoughts, I heard it. A long, low howl that drifted in from the forest. It wasn't the howl of any ordinary dog. It was more like a lament, raw and filled with sorrow. I shrugged it off at first, blaming it on the natural sounds of a wild, untamed forest. Still, an uneasy feeling gnawed at me. The next morning, while I was setting out my coffee cup and newspaper on a rickety table near my RV, I noticed strange impressions in the soft earth around my rig. Paw prints, large and unmistakable, that led off toward the woods. I could not recall ever having seen any dog wandering about here. Later that day, I found that some of my personal items, old photographs, letters from better times, had inexplicably been moved from where I had left them. I wondered if a stray animal had been rummaging through my things, but the prints seemed far too large and deliberate. It wasn't long before I encountered Elena. I first noticed her when I was checking on my RV in the early afternoon. A stray dog, her fur a mottled mix of black and brown, appeared at the edge of my campsite. Her eyes, bright and curious, met mine with an intensity that was almost knowing. At first, she hung back, wary of my approach, but as the days passed, Elena began to follow me around. She would appear as I stepped out for a walk or sit quietly by my RV as I prepared a meal. Despite her rough appearance, there was something comforting in her silent companionship, a gentle reminder that even in isolation, one isn't completely alone. Desperate for a break from the heavy solitude, I ventured into town one humid morning and found myself at a small downbeat diner run by a man known as Big Frank. The diner was dimly lit, with vinyl booths that had seen better days and a counter that creaked with every step. I slid into a seat at the counter, ordered a plate of greasy food and a strong cup of bitter coffee, and listened as Frank recounted local lore with a mixture of gravitas and resignation. "Now, listen here, son," Frank said, leaning in close, his voice gravelly from years of cigarette smoke and hard labor. "They say that every so often, when a man's heart is heavy with regret, the hellhound of Silver Cypress comes to pay him a visit. A spectral beast, they call it, big as a nightmare, with eyes that burn like embers. It shows up on nights when isolation and sorrow run high. Folks say it's either an omen or a curse, depending on who you ask." I listened, skeptical yet strangely moved. I'd never been one to believe in ghost stories, but something in Frank's tone, An authenticity born of hard years made me pause and consider. That night, I returned to my RV with Frank's words echoing in my mind. I sat on the steps outside, the humid air wrapping around me like a damp shroud. The forest was dark and silent. But then I heard it again, the mournful howl that seemed to vibrate in my bones. I shivered as I looked out toward the tree line where shadows danced in the fading light. And then, unmistakably, I saw it. Out in the distance, moving silently among the towering cypress trees, was a huge black shape. For a moment it stood still as if watching me, and then it melted into the mist. The image seared itself into my mind. A hulking, spectral dog with a glow that I could almost call eyes. In the days that followed, the encounters became increasingly strange. Elena, who had become my constant companion, started to act oddly. She would bark at seemingly empty air and often guide me toward the forest edge, as if drawn by something unseen. At night, I found myself tormented by dreams. In those dreams, I was chased through an endless corridor of darkness by a monstrous black dog, its eyes burning with an otherworldly fire. The visions brought back memories of my failures, my ruined marriage, the sacrifices I had made in pursuit of a corporate career, and the crushing loneliness that had driven me here. I began to suspect that the creature might be more than just a legend, that it was somehow linked to my own inner torment. Unable to keep my growing anxiety to myself, I revisited Big Frank at the diner one evening. I recounted the strange prints, the eerie sounds, and my unsettling dreams. Frank listened silently, nodding slowly. "You've got a lot of pain inside you, Mark," he said softly, polishing a stained countertop with a rag. "Sometimes, our regrets and sorrows have a way of manifesting in ways we can't control. The hellhound might be a reflection of that. An omen or a punishment for a life weighed down by guilt." I left the diner with a lump in my throat and a mind swirling with confusion. Was the creature real, or was it a figment of my troubled psyche? One particularly foggy night, after a day filled with heavy silence and unspoken regret, I found myself succumbing to an impulsive urge to explore. I had been drinking a bit, nothing too much, just enough to dull the edges of my thoughts, and the spectral glow of an unseen light beckoned me toward the forest. Elena followed, tail low but eyes alert, as if she understood that something was about to happen. I walked along a narrow, overgrown path, the dense fog muting the world around me. The air was thick and damp, and every step seemed to echo in the silence. Then, as if guided by some invisible force, I saw a flicker of movement ahead, a subtle, shifting luminescence among the trees. It was not the normal glow of fireflies, but something more deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest as I drew closer, each step a mix of dread and determination. The light coalesced into the unmistakable shape of a large, spectral black dog. Its fur seemed to ripple with darkness, and its eyes, or what I assumed were its eyes, glowed with a fierce, ember-like intensity. For a long, agonizing moment, the creature regarded me. I could feel its gaze burning into me, as if it were reading the deepest, darkest corners of my soul. In that moment, I was overwhelmed by every regret and sorrow I had ever harbored. The echoes of a failed marriage, the sacrifices of a career that left me hollow, the loneliness that had driven me to this isolated existence. The hellhound seemed to feed on that despair, its presence both terrifying and profoundly personal. Frozen by terror and introspection, I could barely muster a whisper. "What do you want from me?" I asked into the silence, though I doubted the beast could understand. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, as if in response to my plea, Elena began barking furiously from behind me. The sound snapped me out of my paralysis, and I turned to see the loyal stray trotting forward, her eyes fixed on the spectral dog. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized that the creature was not merely an external force of terror, but a manifestation of my own internal darkness, a physical embodiment of all the guilt and regret I had tried so hard to bury. With a surge of desperate determination, I squared my shoulders and shouted into the night, "I refuse to be defined by my past. I won't let you take me." I don't know if my words reached the beast or if they were swallowed by the fog, but I felt a flicker of defiance deep within me. The hellhound's eyes seemed to waver, its form flickering as if the strength of my will had struck a chord. It let out a long, mournful howl that blended sorrow with rage, a sound that reverberated through the silent forest and shook me to my core. For a moment, the creature paused, as if contemplating my challenge. Then, with a final echoing cry, it turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the dense mist. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, heart pounding and mind reeling from the confrontation. Elena stayed by my side, her presence a steady reminder that I wasn't alone in this dark journey. Slowly, I made my way back to the RV park, my steps heavy but resolute. The night seemed to lighten just a bit as I emerged from the forest, and I could feel a fragile sense of clarity seeping in. Over the following days, the terror of that night lingered in my thoughts. I began to write down everything in an old, battered journal, a chronicle of my encounters, my dreams, and the relentless presence of the hellhound. I couldn't be sure if the creature was truly supernatural or simply a projection of my own internal anguish. But in either case, I knew I had to confront my past in order to move forward. Back at the park, life slowly resumed a semblance of normalcy. The eerie howls in the night became less frequent, and the strange paw prints near my RV faded with the passing days. Yet, I could still feel the weight of that night every time I glanced toward the ancient cypress trees. The memory of the hellhound's ember eyes, the raw echo of its mournful howl, and the surge of determination that followed would haunt my dreams for a long time. Big Frank continued to serve his coffee at the diner, his gruff demeanor softened by the knowledge that the legends of Silver Cypress were more than mere stories. And Elena, that steadfast, perceptive stray, remained by my side, a silent guardian against the encroaching darkness. Now, as I sit in the quiet of my RV on another humid night, the soft rustle of cypress leaves and the distant murmur of the forest remind me that some wounds never fully heal. I can still recall the hellhound's spectral form and the way it seemed to embody all the regrets I had carried for years. I wonder if it will ever truly be vanquished, or if it will continue to lurk on the periphery of my vision, a constant reminder that the past, with all its pain, is never entirely behind us. I have come to accept that my journey toward redemption is far from over. Every day I strive to move forward, to transform my inner darkness into something stronger, a determination to live fully despite the scars of my past. And though the spectral beast may have receded into the mists of Silver Cypress, I know that the battle with one's inner demons is a lifelong struggle. In those rare quiet moments, when the night is still and the forest is cloaked in shadow, I sometimes think I hear a distant, low howl, a reminder that even when we think we have escaped our regrets, they have a way of following us into the silence. And yet, I also hear the steady, comforting steps of a loyal companion by my side, urging me to keep moving forward. That is my truth now, to face the darkness, both without and within, and to forge a new path out of regret, one determined step at a time. I continue to write in my journal, capturing every fleeting moment of fear, defiance, and hope. Each word is a testament to my struggle, a small beacon of light against the vast, engulfing darkness. And as I look out across the park, toward the ancient, whispering cypresses, I know that redemption is not the absence of scars, but the courage to live with them, and to let even the most spectral of nightmares transform into the promise of a better tomorrow. My name is Derek Cole. I am 33. This happened at Pine Hollow RV Park, on the outskirts of an abandoned logging town in northern Florida. I had come here seeking refuge and creative inspiration after a painful breakup that left my heart shattered. As a travel writer and amateur photographer, I'd hoped that a change of scenery, a secluded RV park tucked against an ancient pine forest, would help me rediscover my voice and perhaps mend my fractured soul. When I pulled my old rig into Pine Hollow RV Park, I was struck by the eerie stillness that permeated the place. The campground was sparse, a scattering of worn-out RVs, a few faded picnic tables, and an unsettling quiet that only deepened as the heavy canopy of pine above blocked out most of the sunlight. From the moment I arrived, odd details began to gnaw at my senses. While setting up camp in a secluded corner of the park, I noticed that some of the pine trees bore strange carvings, hand-carved symbols that looked disturbingly ancient, as if etched by desperate hands long ago. The markings were barely visible in the daylight, but as dusk fell and the humid air thickened, they seemed to glow faintly in the twilight. I couldn't help but feel that these signs hinted at secrets the forest was desperate to keep. My first few nights were restless. I lay awake in my RV listening to the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant, almost musical sound of a voice I couldn't place. A soft chant carried on the breeze. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my tired mind, fueled by the lingering pain of my breakup. Yet, there were moments when I thought I caught sight of a pale figure drifting along the edge of the forest. A woman in a tattered dress, standing silently among the trees, watching me with sorrowful eyes before disappearing into the gloom. Desperate for some explanation, I made a trip into the nearby ghost town, where I found a small curio shop run by Miss Constance, a gentle, soft-spoken local historian in her late 60s. Over a cup of weak tea in her cramped, cluttered shop, she told me the legend of the Witch of Pine Hollow. According to her, centuries ago, a woman accused of witchcraft was burned at the stake by vengeful settlers. Her spirit, tormented and furious at the injustice, was cursed to wander the forest forever. Now, she roamed these pines, punishing those whose broken hearts and neglect of nature made them vulnerable to her curse. Miss Constance's eyes met mine with a mixture of pity and warning as she added, "Some spirits, Derek, never truly leave us. They linger, waiting for the right moment to remind us that pain must be let go if we are to find healing." I left her shop with a heavy heart and an uneasy mind. I had always been a skeptic, believing that my creative turmoil was nothing more than a personal failing, not something that could attract the supernatural. Yet, in the days that followed, inexplicable events began to shake that certainty. At first, it was subtle. A photograph I had taken during the late afternoon would show in the background faint carvings that weren't there when I snapped the picture. My belongings inside the RV would be slightly rearranged, as if someone had rifled through them while I slept. Then, as night fell, the strange figure from the edge of the forest started to appear more frequently. Often, I would catch a glimpse of her, a mysterious, spectral woman whose features were fleeting and indeterminate. She would appear at dusk, just as the fog began to roll in, and her eyes would seem to plead for something I couldn't decipher. Her presence was accompanied by a faint, melancholic murmur, as if she were trying to communicate a message of release from pain. The turning point came one foggy evening when I decided to take my camera for a walk near the forest's edge. The mist was thick enough to blur reality, and every step I took seemed to lead me deeper into a world where the past and the present blurred into one. As I wandered, I noticed the familiar carvings on the trees glowing softly in the fog. My pulse quickened when, out of the haze, I saw a group of figures gathered in a clearing. Drawn by a mixture of curiosity and dread, I crept closer. The clearing was illuminated by an eerie, shifting light that did not come from any natural source. In the center stood a makeshift altar adorned with the same cryptic symbols I'd seen on the trees. I could hear hushed voices chanting in the language I couldn't understand, a rhythmic, sorrowful dirge that sent shivers down my spine. My heart pounded as I realized that a small coven had gathered there, their faces obscured by shadows and hooded cloaks. I could barely comprehend what I was witnessing until I saw them clearly. They were performing a ritual, and I, with my broken heart and lingering despair, seemed to be their unwitting target. Before I could react, I felt a heavy force seize me. It was as if invisible hands had pulled me from the path and dragged me towards the center of the clearing. I struggled, but my body felt numb, and soon I was overcome by darkness and disorientation. When I came to, I found myself bound to a crude wooden post near the altar. Panic surged through me as I realized that I had been abducted. Around me, members of the coven chanted louder, their voices rising in a fevered pitch that resonated deep within my bones. The atmosphere was charged with a dark energy, and then, amid the swirling fog and flickering lights, the mysterious woman reappeared. At first, she was a pale, ethereal figure, but in a heart-stopping moment, her features shifted and twisted until they revealed the horrifying visage of the Witch of Pine Hollow herself. Her eyes burned with an ancient, unyielding fury, and her presence exuded a palpable sense of vengeance. I felt the weight of centuries of torment and betrayal, as if the witch were not merely a spectral figure, but the embodiment of every shattered dream and every unhealed wound. I was the chosen sacrifice, a symbol of brokenness meant to appease her wrath, and perhaps to serve as a catalyst for her twisted sense of justice. The coven's chanting reached a crescendo, and the air around me seemed to vibrate with the power of their incantations. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears as the witch's eyes bore into mine, compelling me to confront the deepest recesses of my own pain. In that excruciating moment, the boundaries between my inner torment and the supernatural horror before me dissolved entirely. Summoning every scrap of will and determination left within me, I fought against the bonds that held me captive. My mind raced with memories of the better parts of my life, snatches of happiness before my breakup, moments of clarity from my travels, the hope I had once carried in my heart. I shouted, "I will not let my pain define me. I refuse to be your sacrifice." My voice, though trembling, carried a defiant resolve that seemed to momentarily disrupt the ritual. The effect was immediate and staggering. The witch recoiled, her malevolent eyes flickering with uncertainty, as if the force of my defiance had shaken her resolve. The coven's chant faltered, and for an instant, silence fell over the clearing. A silence so profound it nearly drowned out the pounding of my heart. In that brief moment, the mysterious woman's spectral form, before it had transformed into the witch's visage, appeared behind me, her expression a blend of sorrow and warning. It was as if she had tried to alert me all along, urging me to confront not only the witch, but also the darkness within myself. Seizing that precious moment of disarray, I wriggled free from the weakened bonds and staggered toward the edge of the clearing. The coven erupted into chaotic shouts, but I could barely register their voices as I ran blindly into the oppressive fog. Every step was a desperate bid for freedom, a leap away from a ritual that sought to trap me in a cycle of perpetual despair. I don't remember exactly how long I ran. Time lost meaning in the endless maze of towering pines and drifting mist. Eventually, exhausted and trembling, I found my way back to the RV park. The faint light of dawn was beginning to break through the darkness, and with it came a fragile sense of safety. In the following days, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened. I returned to Miss Constance's curio shop, desperate for answers and solace. She listened silently as I recounted my ordeal, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. "Some spirits, Derek," she said gently, "are not easily exorcised. The witch's curse is woven into the fabric of this land, and she chooses her moments to remind us that the past, with all its pain and loss, is never truly behind us." Her words, though cryptic, offered a measure of comfort. I realized that what I had experienced might be a punishment, or perhaps a grim catalyst for healing, meant to force me to confront the unhealed wounds of my heart. Now, as I sit in my RV on a humid, quiet morning, I find myself haunted by the lingering echoes of that night. I still see, in the recesses of my mind, the twisted features of the witch of Pine Hollow and the sorrowful gaze of the mysterious woman who tried to warn me. I write in my journal every day, trying to make sense of the blend of myth and personal trauma that has forever altered my existence. I know that healing is not a linear process, and that the scars of the past never truly vanish. But I also know that by facing my inner demons, I can begin to forge a new path. A path where the pain of broken love and loss is transformed into a source of strength and wisdom. The curse of Pine Hollow may linger in the mists of the forest, but so too does the promise of renewal. Sometimes, when the fog drifts in and the wind carries a distant, sorrowful chant through the pines, I glimpse a shadow flitting between the trees. I cannot say for sure whether it is the witch herself or merely the echo of my own grief. Yet, in those moments, I remind myself that while the past may haunt us, it need not define us. I continue my journey with a cautious hope, determined to rebuild not just my life, but my very soul. The experience at Pine Hollow has taught me that confronting the darkness, both within and without, is the only way to truly move forward. And as I write these words, I feel a fragile light growing within me, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the most ancient and sorrowful of curses. My name is Jared Martinez. I'm 28. This happened at Hollow's Edge RV Park, on the outskirts of an abandoned farming community in rural North Florida, near the Everglades. After a painful breakup that left me questioning everything I once believed about love and my own worth, I dropped out of college and set off on a journey to rediscover my creative spark. I'd always been a travel writer and an amateur photographer, but lately my world had turned bleak, a barren field devoid of inspiration. When I heard about Hollow's Edge RV Park, a secluded campground where dilapidated RVs sat among overgrown fields and rusted farm equipment, I felt a pull I couldn't ignore. I hoped that the isolation and raw beauty of this forgotten place might offer me the solace and inspiration I so desperately needed. I arrived on a sweltering August afternoon. The RV park was quiet, almost unnervingly so. A few old trailers lay scattered among fields choked with tall wild grass and abandoned cornfields. The remnants of an old farming community were everywhere. Rusted tractors half buried in mud, scarecrows with tattered clothes, and weathered fences bearing strange, hand-carved symbols that I couldn't quite decipher. I parked my old RV in a secluded corner, determined to make this desolate place my sanctuary for the next few weeks. The first night was thick with humidity and silence. I set up my camera and laptop inside the RV, planning to write about the desolation and capture the haunting beauty of the surroundings. But as twilight deepened, an unsettling feeling began to seep into my bones. I couldn't shake the impression that I was being watched by the land itself. While reviewing some of my photographs later that evening, I discovered something odd. A blurry, almost ghostly silhouette of a man standing amid the fields. I stared at the image, heart pounding, wondering if it was merely a trick of the light or my exhausted eyes playing games with me. Over the next few days, I noticed more strange occurrences. At dusk, as the fading light battled the encroaching darkness, I began to see eerie scarecrows in the fields that seemed to have shifted positions overnight. The ancient symbols on the fences, barely visible during the day, glowed faintly in the twilight. And more unsettling still, personal items I had left undisturbed inside the RV, a few old photographs, a notebook filled with my musings, were inexplicably moved, as if by unseen hands. I tried to convince myself that my mind, still raw from heartbreak, was imagining these signs, but a deep, nagging dread began to take hold. One rainy afternoon, I decided I needed some answers. I drove a short distance into the nearby ghost town and made my way to the modest sheriff's office, where I met Officer Bailey, a grizzled local with a weary gaze and a voice that carried the weight of years spent patrolling these forgotten roads. Over a cup of bitter coffee in his cluttered, dim office, I cautiously broached the subject of the strange happenings around Hollow's Edge. Officer Bailey leaned back in his creaky chair and sighed. "You're not the first to come here looking for solace," he said slowly, "but there's a legend in these parts that I'd rather not see come to life. Folks around here talk about the Harvest Man, a gaunt, spectral figure who appears at twilight among the abandoned fields. They say he was once a ruthless man, a soul so burdened by regret and cruelty that his spirit couldn't find peace even in death. Now he roams these lands during the harvest season, preying on lost souls who wander too far from safety." He studied me for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "If you're carrying a heavy heart, son, maybe you're more susceptible than you think." I left the station with Officer Bailey's words echoing in my mind. Despite my rational skepticism, I couldn't shake the chill that his story had given me. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and oranges, I ventured out with my camera in hand, intent on capturing the mood of the fields. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and a thick fog began to roll in from the Everglades, softening the edges of the decaying landscape. I walked along a narrow, overgrown path that led me toward an old cornfield. There, among the tall, dying stalks, I saw it. A faint, flickering glow in the distance. It wasn't the warm light of a firefly or any natural phenomenon I recognized. Instead, it was the dim, wavering light of a lantern, moving slowly as if carried by an unseen presence. My pulse quickened. I raised my camera and snapped several photos, the shutter clicking repeatedly in the hush of the twilight. As I moved closer, the light became more distinct, and I could make out a shape emerging from the fog. It was a man, or rather a figure that resembled a man. He was gaunt, his frame unnaturally thin, and he wore clothing that looked like it had been scavenged from a long-forgotten era. Tattered, dirt-stained, and reminiscent of a scarecrow. Clutched in his bony hand was that same flickering lantern, its light casting grotesque, shifting shadows across his face. The sight was both mesmerizing and horrifying. For a long, agonizing moment, I stood there, frozen in place, as if the Harvest Man's gaze were weighing every regret and every sorrow I had ever carried. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he began to move. With deliberate, almost spectral steps, he made his way across the field. I followed at a distance, drawn by a mix of terror and a desperate need to understand what I was witnessing. The closer I got, the more I felt as if the presence of this cursed spirit was resonating with my own inner despair. Each step he took seemed to echo the silent beat of a broken heart. I trailed him until he reached the center of a particularly desolate field. There, amidst the decaying remains of abandoned farm equipment and weathered scarecrows, he stopped. I crouched behind a rusted tractor, my breath coming in shallow gasps, watching as the harvest man turned slowly to face me. His eyes were hollow and sunken, yet they burned with an eerie, flickering intensity, almost as if they held the weight of countless lost souls. For a moment, it felt as if he could see right through me, reading every hidden regret and every unspoken sorrow. Then, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper carried by the wind, he uttered something that sounded disturbingly like my own inner lament, a sound that resonated with all the pain I had tried so hard to bury. I felt a surge of terror mixed with an inexplicable sense of familiarity. In that moment, I realized that the harvest man might not be merely a ghostly legend, but a manifestation of the collective despair and regret of those who have wandered these lands. Perhaps, in my own vulnerability, I had invited his presence. Panic surged through me. Without a second thought, I turned and ran, stumbling over uneven ground as I fled the field. The sound of my pounding footsteps was soon joined by a low, mournful moan that seemed to follow me, a sound that could have been the harvest man calling me back, or the echo of my own despair. I ran until I could no longer see the spectral glow of the lantern, until the oppressive darkness of the field was replaced by the relative safety of the overgrown path that led back to the RV park. I didn't stop running until I reached an old, dilapidated barn on the park's outskirts. Inside, in the musty darkness, I huddled in a corner, heart hammering in my chest. Every creak of the wooden structure and every rustle of the wind outside sent fresh waves of terror through me. I waited in silence until the first light of dawn seeped through the broken slats, promising that the nightmare of the night was finally over. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. I reviewed the photographs I'd taken, and while some images were blurry and indistinct, a few captured the unmistakable outline of a gaunt figure holding a flickering lantern. I wrote furiously in my journal, trying to piece together the puzzle of the harvest man. I even returned to Officer Bailey, who confirmed that similar sightings had been reported for decades. According to local lore, the harvest man was the restless spirit of a cruel man who once terrorized these lands, his soul condemned to roam the fields and exact a terrible vengeance on those whose hearts were heavy with regret. As I packed my belongings and prepared to leave Hollow's Edge RV Park, I couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had left an indelible mark on me. Driving away in my RV that morning, I glanced back at the fading outline of the park and the distant, overgrown fields. Through the early morning mist, I thought I could see a faint, flickering glow, perhaps the lantern of the harvest man, still lingering among the rustling cornstalks. It was a silent promise that some ghosts, whether real or imagined, never truly leave you behind. Now, as I sit here in a quiet motel room far from that haunted place, I still find myself haunted by the memories of that night. I review my journal entries and photographs, each detail a reminder of the confrontation with something beyond the natural world, and perhaps a reflection of the inner demons I've long tried to escape. The experience forced me to face my own vulnerability, my regrets, and the pain that I carried in my heart. I'm not sure if the harvest man was an actual specter roaming those abandoned fields or simply a manifestation of the collective sorrow of lost souls. What I do know is that my encounter with that spectral figure has changed me forever. I've come to understand that healing is not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it and finding the strength to forge a new path despite its lingering shadows. The ghostly lantern that flickered in the darkness may forever symbolize a part of me that once was broken and vulnerable, but I'm determined that it will not define me. I now see the harvest man as a mirror reflecting my own inner struggles, a reminder that sometimes the things we fear the most are the ones we must confront in order to move forward. Every so often, when the night is quiet and the wind whispers through the trees, I still hear the distant, mournful moan that once chased me through those desolate fields. And though I've long left Hollow's Edge behind, I know that some ghosts, whether born of old curses or the depths of our own hearts, never truly vanish. They remain, a quiet, persistent echo in the chambers of memory, urging us to keep moving forward even when the past feels inescapable. That is the truth I carry with me now, as I continue my journey to reclaim my creative spirit and rebuild my life. Every day is a step away from the darkness, yet I know that true healing comes not from forgetting, but from embracing the scars and learning to live with them. And as I write these words, I feel a fragile hope that one day I'll no longer be haunted by the ghost of regret, but instead be defined by the strength it took to overcome it.